But art and beauty were brutally separated by Marcel Duchamp when he sent a urinal, which he called euphemistically the fountain, to an art exhibit, because not all works of art, even great works of art, are necessarily experienced as beautiful. So again, in our experiment, we separate art from beauty and concentrate on beauty alone. Now, because there is no universal standard of beauty and no single set of characteristics that defines beauty that's been agreed upon, we chose to concentrate on the beauty as experienced by each individual subject. We had subjects representing different cultures and different ethnic backgrounds and different educational backgrounds, but each subject had to rate what they heard or what they saw on a scale of 1 to 10 as beautiful or not beautiful. And none of the participants in these experiments was actually an artist or a musician, because we wanted to avoid knowledge in these areas. So the trick is to ask subjects to come to our lab and view many paintings and listen to many musical excerpts, and each one gives his own rating for how beautiful they were or how beautifully they experienced them to be. And then we put them in the scanner where they view these things again, and we monitor the activity in their brains. Now, let me just explain very briefly that what happens when in an area which is especially active, an area of the brain which is especially active, is that its cells respond far more vigorously, and their metabolic requirement increases, and so more blood is channeled to that part of the brain, and this change in blood flow can be captured by the scanners. So let me show you an example of a painting which most people, but not all, rated as very beautiful, the Odalisque by Ingres. And here is another painting which most people, but not all, rated as ugly, although it is a painting by Lucien Freud of considerable artistic merit in that it projects truths. It was nevertheless not experienced as beautiful by most subjects. And the same is true of musical excerpts. Now, these musical excerpts lasting 16 seconds, just as long as the visual presentations lasted, most people, most subjects rated the adagietto from they were actually they were asked to listen to excerpts of music derived from jazz and classical music and from Eastern and Western cultures. Most people rated the adagietto from Mahler's Fifth Symphony as beautiful. And most people rated the second violin concerto of Ligeti as ugly, which does not, again, let me emphasize, mean that it doesn't have considerable musical merit. But these were not musicians. We were just asking them about their experience when they listened to it. So these are the stimuli. And when you look at the brain, of course, the visual input goes to one part of the brain, and the auditory musical input goes to another part of the brain. So here is the visual input, and that's the auditory input. But when you look to see which parts of the brain are especially active when subjects experience beauty, you find that in addition to the visual areas and other areas which I'll not talk about, there is this area here in the medial-orbitofrontal cortex, a part of the emotional brain, part of the reward centers of the brain. And when you look at which parts of the brain were active when they experienced musical beauty, you find, again, in addition to the auditory areas, plus other areas, there is this area here in the medial-orbitofrontal cortex, which is especially active. And when you add the two, you find there is one area, and one area alone, which always correlates with the experience of beauty. And hence, we can now answer the question, is there a characteristic or a single set of characteristics that defines beauty? The answer is yes, but the answer comes from a very surprising source. It comes from the brain, not from the works of art. So, to that extent, the answer to the question, what is beauty, is rather simple. Now, if you go back and ask yourself, well, philosophy of aesthetics has been debating for centuries whether judgments of beauty can ever be quantified. And so, if you look at visual beauty, here is the area which is active in the medial orbital frontal cortex, and if you look at the strengths of activity there in relation to the declared intensity of the experience of beauty, you find that the higher the experience of beauty, the higher the activity as measured by the change in blood flow. And if you look at musical beauty, you get much the same picture with musical excerpts that are experienced as very beautiful. The activity is much more intense in that area than with musical excerpts which are deemed to be indifferent or ugly. And the same is true for ugliness, by the way. Stimuli which are rated as ugly activate a different system, a different part of the brain, the amygdala here and the motor cortex there, as if you're mobilizing the motor system to protect yourself against ugliness. And again, if you look at the intensity of activity in these areas in relation to the declared experience of ugliness or beauty, you'll find that the uglier the stimulus, the more intense the activity in the amygdala or in the motor cortex. So that, and I think it's a very important point to get across, that for the first time in human history, subjective mental states which belong in our private world, can actually not only be localized, but can be quantified. Now, in the world literature of love, beauty is linked with desire and with love. So is there any link in the brain to mirror the link that you find in that world literature? And the answer is yes. Without going into this experiment in great detail, let me just tell you that when people look at events or persons or objects that they desire and rate them in exactly the same way in which they rated the musical and the visual excerpts, you'll find that there is one area, a common area of activity located here in the medial orbital frontal cortex, which happens to be the area which is active when you experience beauty, and it also happens to be the area which is active when you look at the face of a person you love very much. So let me reiterate again, the simple answer to a complex question is yes, there is a single characteristic which defines the experience of beauty, and that characteristic resides in the brain. Now, this raises, of course, very tricky questions, and now comes the complex part, the complex answer. When you look at a painting like that, which you qualify as beautiful, the activity goes through the retina, the optic pathways, to the primary optic cortex, to the specialized areas that are specialized for detecting and processing bodies, and then goes to the medial orbital frontal cortex somehow, and you experience beauty. And when you experience the same category of painting as ugly, the pathways from the retina to the cortex up to this region are the same, but from then on, signals are sent off to another area. So there must be some kind of filter somewhere in the brain which decides, some system, some mechanism which decides where to send the signals to. And there you go back to the definition, and it's wonderful for us in science that we've got such a rich history in philosophy and in history of art, which we can rely on for inspiration. If you look at the definition of Edmund Burke, beauty is for the most part some quality in bodies acting mechanically upon the human mind by the intervention of the senses.